The whole notion of the American dream was really about moving from an industrial society to a leisure society, where people went from, kids working in factories and the Depression to post-war, where you had lots and lots of affluence in the middle class. So advertising in the 50s and the 60s really brought to this burgeoning middle class. The American dream was product. It wasn't like everybody could go to philosophy school. It was, I could have a stereo, I could have a color TV.
You always remember who was the first kid in the apartment house, or who was the first family on the street that got a TV. That I can remember the first car we got as a family. I mean, everybody on the block in Brooklyn looked out the window because we had a car,
The way the American dream is presented is for us to purchase it. The American dream itself is already a commercial aspiration. It's that which you ought to aspire to, you ought to desire. You want this dream. So the logic of advertising psychology is already present in the very form of the American dream.
I think that the American dream is so many different things to so many different people. And we're a materialistic society, we're a capitalistic society, and we think the American dream can be purchased, because otherwise people wouldn't be in department stores, we wouldn't be buying makeup the way we do.
People have come from other countries to live here. For what reason? To incorporate the American dream into their life. Part of what I would call advertising environment is set up to make you believe that there's always more, there's always better. And if you can afford it, you should have it.
On a fundamental level, advertising disconnects us with reality so that we value the dream, aspire for the dream. We experience it as a role model, not in a conscious way, but just because of its enormous presence in our lives. The first person that needs to buy advertising is the sponsor. Sponsors have to believe that they need to advertise their products or no one will buy it. That itself is the accomplishment of the advertising industry to get all the other industries to believe that the advertising industry is necessary. And in that sense, advertising advertises advertising.
There's an element of insanity to the business for sure, because you come in and somebody hands you a product and says, make up a movie to talk about this product and make it interesting.
New Beech Nut Frosty Mint Gum.
More flavor to choose. More flavors to choose. The flavor starts lively. The flavor stays lively. By Beech Nut. By Beech Nut. By Beech Nut. By gum.
The better an agency is able to understand how to market to a consumer, the more valuable they are and the more likely they are to have someone choose them to be their agency, to be their interpreter of the marketplace.
A lot of the products people buy are pretty mundane. The trick is to try and find something that's meaningful to people in something that's fairly mundane.
The most brilliant dimension of advertising is that, for the most part, we who are tremendously affected by it have no sense that we are affected by it. And none of us actually stop and look and really think about, oh, there's an ad, what is it appealing to, what do I think about it, what's going on with it? And we're exposed to roughly 3,000 ads a day.
During the 60s, being an ad man was not something that was admired. I think it began very shortly thereafter to be very fashionable. And again, I think it was that whole glamour thing coming in, and I think there was certainly something about creating a product that influenced people, that you saw in magazines, that you might see on television. Because when I came along, I thought it was a pretty glamorous career.
You got to remember that up until this moment in time, the business was really very much what I used to call the supermarket approach. I mean, a client would put in a brief. The account guy, who was king in those days, would take a basket, and he'd walk up and down the agency and he'd get a piece of writing from a copywriter, and then he would go find an art director. And he was the one who was collecting all these various components, so to speak, and out would come an ad or a commercial. The business changed dramatically when there was this emphasis on the creative product, which started to come in the 1960s, which obliged people to work together from the beginning because it was based on an idea, it was based on concepts.
But when it comes to brewing beer, there is a difference of opinion that really matters.
I'm from Milwaukee, and I ought to know. It's scratch brewed Blatz beer wherever you go. Smoother, fresher,
Less belly, that's clear.
Blatz is Milwaukee's finest beer.
By 1967, a full creative revolution. Suddenly, the copywriters were all Jewish, the art directors were all Italian, and street kids who didn't have a great education, suddenly were in advertising. And it was working.
When advertising stopped being so manipulative and started to be more artful, was like a real breakthrough creative renaissance time.
It was a prestigious place to be in advertising. I mean, everybody who graduated from college wanted to be in advertising. For us, it was fabulous. There was no other world for us except that. It was competitive, it was rewarding.
When a job asks you to be the best that you can be, that makes you shine inside, that makes you want to go to work.
We were so full of ourselves. We really thought we could slay the world.
People sometimes describe advertising people as madmen, and it's because the business is pretty insane.
It was a pretty wild time. There were so many wild, wacky things that happened back in those days. It was by far the most fun you could have with your clothes on.
I've heard the stories about people being hung out windows by their ankles. I've heard stories of people driving up the steps of the Metropolitan Museum in a Jeep.
It was playtime all the time. A lot of babes, a lot of honeys. Huns was a big, big word back in those days. And, clearly that would never be acceptable today.
If you started using terms like doll and sweetheart at this point in time, you'd really be viewed as somebody from another era. It's just not acceptable. And the reason it's not acceptable is because it's essentially trivializing and making women childlike.
There was a lot of hanky-panky at various agencies, even the little ones that I worked at. And the hanky-panky went on behind closed doors. I mean, I don't want you to think that I hanked and panked. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it was always elegant.
Women were slowly beginning to have a little bit more say over their reproductive life. They were less vulnerable to the existing patriarchal male power structure. That gives one a sense of autonomy and independence.
I think that the advertising industry, within the industry, was incredibly supportive of women. Took a while for women to become the biz types.
People like to be among their own kind. They like tribalism. They like to be with their own group. And it's a little hard to adjust when another group comes along. And you have to zig and zag and kind of figure out ways to handle it. And I'm sure that it wasn't particularly welcome.
You hear a lot about men in the 60s and 70s who didn't like working with women. Political correctness kind of started in the 70s.
I think that being politically correct takes creativity out of life. You really don't have as much creativity as you would have when people could feel that they could do or say almost anything.
When I encounter young women just entering this business, it stuns me that they meet with the same sorts of issues that somebody entering it maybe 30 years ago would have encountered.
Sex, as anything else which you could categorize as sensational, it can get your attention.
Sex sells today, and it always sold. It's always appealing.
I still think that sex is used more in advertising for men.
Youth and sexiness have always sort of been pretty much staples in advertising.
In the 60s, you'd see a lot of women in evening gowns opening up refrigerators and car doors.
Drape a beautiful woman's body on a car. In some sense, the car then gets erotically charged. It gets almost humanized. So you say, wow, that's a sexy car.
I don't remember when the feminine mystique came out, but I do think it changed things. And I think it was sort of a reaction to the Eisenhower era, too, because the Kennedys were in the White House in the early 60s and so forth, and I think that at least gave people permission to open up in terms of a little bit of glamour.
The focus on the housewife in the 60s advertising It wasn't for the most part on elderly housewives. It was glamorous housewives and all the products that would bring about that sort of idealized world.
A lot of the advertising in the 60s was geared to housewives, but a lot of housewives were young because people had children earlier.
What advertisers recognized was that these women were at home, some not terribly happy about their lot in life, and so the idea was that advertising was supposed to glamorize their life. That message in the 60s was, buy our product, have a great household, make the man in your life happy, have your children healthy, and you're going to be a very proud and also accomplished housewife.
The phenomena of identification is one of the central processes happening in that space between me and ads. I see something and I want that. I identify with that and I want to become like that.
Advertising exists really on a fantasy in many ways. It is based on achieving a fantasy or living a fantasy.
So ads are designed for us to immediately identify with the people in the ad and to want to be a member of the world that the advertising is opening up for us.
The Nixon-Kennedy campaign was the first campaign that dealt with kind of modern political advertising. Mass media used to sell a candidate.
The Nixon-Kennedy campaign was all about image. It was all about image because everybody knows at this point in time that the radio version of the debates heavily favored Nixon, but there was no question on television. I mean, people were ready for somebody like Jack Kennedy and the Kennedy family, and that was, of course, marketing. The Kennedys were just right for the times. We had come out of an Eisenhower era, and they were glamorous and young. Boy, it sure looked wonderful.
It really was the transition of presidential politics to being a visual media. Once people recognized that, you then got a lot of media consultants involved in the process of electing.
Advertising has transformed politics into a commercial game. Which candidate do you buy? Who looks telegenic? Who comes off most powerfully in the media? Whose commercials are more effective than who? It's advertising that's having the impact on politics, not politics that's having the impact on advertising. The necessary humility of advertisers is the product comes first, not the artist. We're not creating works of art. We're selling products. We don't want people to focus their attention on the quality of the ad itself. It'll distract them from the product and the dynamics of wanting the product.
The Volkswagen campaign is a legendary campaign and is very much beloved by creative people because it was a very different tonality for car ads.
Everything about that campaign was right. Tone of voice was right, the look was right, and it was all consistent with the product itself.
I remember simplicity. I remember the Volkswagen sitting there in the middle of the page. It looked just adorable and cute.
The advertising just had a wonderful intelligence and thoughtfulness and a sense of humor about itself. It was very honest. They did a very famous Volkswagen ad in California, and it talked about how there was a blemish in the strip of metal above the glove compartment, and so they had sent it back. They were saying, even though it's an inexpensive product, it's a quality product, but they were saying it in a very kind of charming and thoughtful way. And that was a big deal in the 60s because all the people who were car buying people were people who'd gone through World War II.
The Volkswagen was a small, cheap, simple mode of transportation. Even the look of the ads was simple, so that the look was consistent with what the product was all about.
It's a great ad. It said, if you think getting into a Volkswagen is going to give you the same experience as getting into a Cadillac, then somebody's lying to you. But if you recognize this is a cute, small little car, quick, easy, get around town, that kind of advertising was appropriate because what it said was, understand our limitations. And if you get that, then, you're not being misled.
Volkswagen was the beginning. It was the first time anyone saw that you could talk to a consumer and tell the total truth without even worrying. So as a result of this, other advertising agencies said, hey, we've discovered the truth, let's do that.
I think it's been called the golden age of advertising agencies. Ads were created inside that agency and put on a few outlets. Media is just so dispersed now, and so many ways to reach consumers that we're just one of them. I'm in cable television, and that's just one of the ways.
Because of technology, people's ability to identify, define, and reach a specific target is so much greater than it ever was.
The internet sort of opened up a whole new space that was not existing there before. Pretty soon, commercials started appearing in that space.
It's different for advertisers because there's only reason they could go and have 3 martini lunches was because it wasn't that complicated. You can't do that now because you have tens of thousands of options into how you run a campaign, from email to viral videos to television spots and everything else. So it's much more complex now.
I can find a social group that you belong to. I can find music that you're interested in. I can find things that you're already plugged into and insert myself into your life. But by the same token, those advances in technology have also created a concomitant problem, which is that I believe that work today has become almost entirely execution-based and not conceptually based. I think people have become so enamored of the ways of producing things right now, all the new forms of media, that sometimes you forget in order for that to be meaningful, you got to have an idea behind that, which always has to stem from the product and its advantages. And I think that's one of the things that the business has forgotten today.
What's happened is that consumers are much more savvy these days. We have many more impressions of advertising that surround us, and so people become jaded. There is that word that for a while used to be evil called TiVo that allows you to fast forward and eliminate advertising from your program.
Advertising is becoming an anonymous business. You don't really know the names of people who are creating advertising now. Agencies don't even have agency names anymore.
There are so many variations and alternatives that it's really hard to measure one against the other. And back then it was much simpler.
The creative revolution is over. Everybody is just holding on to their jobs, and no one is going to ever say to a client, buy this or resign your account. They don't do it anymore. It's now, where would you, how would you like it? When can I change it for you?
If all advertising ceased tomorrow, what would happen to our world, to our economy? Everyone said, absolutely, you can't do that. It would collapse. That is a fantastic advertisement.